do this. I'm gonna go live right now.
Hello, I'm Cynthia from Pacific College of Health and Science, Continuing Education. Welcome to Pacific College of Health and Science YouTube Special Topics. Tonight we're sharing narrative medicine. Welcome to Pacific College of Health and Science YouTube Special Topics. Tonight we're sharing narrative medicine, therapeutic use of stories in the healing process with Robert Vetter. Our presentation tonight is being hosted by Carline Ortiz, an associate professor in our holistic nursing program. If you have questions, please post them in the chat and we'll do our best to set aside some time at the end for questions as well. Please welcome Carline Ortiz and Robert Vetter.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm really happy to have this opportunity to welcome you and also welcome a very good friend of mine, Robert Vetter. As Cynthia said, I am an associate professor of nursing at Pacific College. But related to this presentation, I take it so much more personally than my professional life. I grew up on the Texas-Mexico border in the Rio Grande Valley. It's on the coast of the Gulf and right on the border with Mexico. A very unique area, as are so many borderlands. And growing up in that area, it is very much Mexican culture melded with American culture, U.S. culture, and Texan culture. But one of the things that I learned or came to learn about something very embedded within the Mexican culture is this concept called a Platika, which literally is a talk. But if we dig down a little bit deeper, a Platika really is a heart-to-heart talk. It's an opportunity to share those stories that are going on within us that might be causing us some concern, maybe some worry, or just something we need to think through. There is also another concept in the word called desahogar, which literally means to undrown oneself. And to give you the image of many times a plática is a way to desahogar or to undrown oneself, which connects us to this idea of sharing our stories, sharing of ourselves with someone else is part of that finding of ourselves again, the working through, the gaining clarity, the finding a light. And these two are very much a part of the Mexican culture to this day. I came across these concepts as part of formal healing in my work and my training with Bob Vetter in curanderismo, which is a Mesoamerican traditional healing system. And I've really come to embrace this idea of this sharing of stories as part of our holistic wellness in mind, body, spirit, emotion, but also in healing of communities and the world beyond just the individual. So in addition to all of Bob's accolades, all the things that he has written and presented on and the interviews he's had, I feel very comfortable in introducing you to someone who finds probably the most honor and expression of love through his adoptions into Native American families of the Comanche, the Kiowa, the Caddo, and the Cheyenne tribes of our country. And also those who have been teachers and mentors of curanderismo for Bob. They've each had their own special place and have been integral into Bob's own healing story and what has become his life journey that I am grateful to be a small part of. So, Bob, thank you so much for being here and for sharing.
Well, thank you, Carline, for that beautiful introduction. And I'm so glad to be here and be a part of all the great work that you guys do at Pacific College. So thank you. So I want to begin by introducing myself. My name is Bob Vetter. I'm coming to you from Eastern Long Island, which is the ancestral home of an Algonquian-speaking group of people called the Montaukets, and the lands here were taken away from them. And I'm going to be talking about indigenous topics tonight. And I feel that it's important, before I get underway, to mention that there are still significant problems that are faced by indigenous people here in North America, known as Turtle Island, as well as all of the Americas and throughout the planet, that Native people are still being mistreated and still denied their basic rights. So although that is not the topic that I'll be covering tonight, I would like everybody to know that I am actively concerned and involved in the social justice for Native people. So I'll begin with, I'm going to screen share in just a moment, and I'll be using stories to talk about stories. So narrative medicine is really all about the use of stories. So I'll be using stories embedded within stories tonight. So let me share my screen. There we go. And give me 1 second. Okay. So the title tonight is Narrative Medicine, Therapeutic Use of Stories in the Healing Process. And we'll define what narrative medicine is. I'll be using the story of how I came upon narrative medicine, the people who I've met who I think are excellent examples of narrative medicine, and almost all of them people who would never use the term themselves. So how do we define narrative medicine? And there are a million definitions of it. I'll just give you this very basic one that was in Wikipedia. Whoops. Sorry about that. Let's go. A medical approach that utilizes people's narratives in clinical practice, research, and education as a way to promote healing. Doing this, narrative medicine aims not only to validate the experience of the patient, but also to encourage creativity and self-reflection to the physician. So basically what we're saying is that it right away, it's changing the nature of the power structure between a medical professional and a patient, to rethink how that works. Rather than a top-down, it's kind of a collaborative way at looking at the healing process. I stumbled upon narrative medicine because of my original interest academically and professionally within anthropology has always been the intersection of healing and spirituality. And to me, that is really the crux of where medicine should live, is where spirituality and healing meet. And I'll use my own story to kind of illustrate how I think narrative medicine is informed from an indigenous perspective. And if we go back far enough in history and we look at Western medicine, we can say that Western medicine must have had a relationship between healer and patient equivalent to what we find in indigenous communities at one time. But changes over time have created this power structure with the physician at the top and everybody else kind of falling in line underneath him or her. And that has been exacerbated by the type of medicine that we practice now, which is, basically 10 minutes in and out, where the doctor hears a story very, very quickly and then offers a story. And I'm going to be suggesting that really the entire process is through the use of story. Maybe not in the way that we normally use that word, but it's all about story. The healing process is all about story, and so is conventional Western medicine, whether we believe it or choose to accept that or not. So my own personal journey in this regard really began with this man that you see on the right, Woodji Watchataker. And I met Woodji Watchataker in 1980 when I was a graduate student at the University of Oklahoma. This photo is probably taken of him, I don't know, probably in the 1940s or something, because he was already an old man when I met him in 1980. Woodji Watchtaker is somebody that I met due to my roommate in grad school, a guy who was part Comanche, and through it's way too long a story to get into now, but eventually I met Woodgie Watchtaker. I met his wife Eva. Now, I had been already looking at Comanche medicine prior to that, and it turned out that Woodgie's wife Eva was the niece of a very famous Comanche medicine woman named Sanapia, that a book had been written about her, an ethnographic monograph describing her practices, her use of herbology, her various techniques of what's called doctoring. And eventually, Woodgie was the one who led me to an old man who would become my first relative in Indian country. So the couple that you see here eventually came to be my adoptive grandma and grandpa. So Oliver, he was known as Chief Patapony, not because it was an official title, but it was a title of respect that many people in the community gave him, and my grandma Esther. And he was the last medicine man, to the best of my knowledge, among the Comanche people when he passed away. And the painting that I have here is a painting that was done by a Comanche artist by the name of Doctate Nevaquaya to describe the vision that Grandpa Chief had. And this in itself is a significant story of healing. So the way that Grandpa Chief explained the story, he said he'd never set out to be a medicine man, but he was already a relatively old man when he got sick and went into the hospital, and they told him that he had cancer. And one day while he was in the hospital, they kept him for a while, and one day while he was there, he said the doctors came in and spoke to him as a group, and they said, we doctors, we had 4 meetings over your case, and we've decided that we've done everything for you that we can. Now you can stay in the hospital if you want, but the only thing we can really do for you now at this point is to reduce your amount of pain, but we've exhausted everything that we know to do. So he told his wife and his son, he said, take me out there to the hills and leave me out there. Now, the plains, native people of the plains, as well as in other parts of Turtle Island, that's the word for North America, have a belief that there are people and there are places that have a special healing power to them. And the spot that is painted on this painting is a place in Southwest Oklahoma called Mount Scott in the Wichita Mountains range. And this was a place that he knew of because a friend of his had been deathly ill and had gone there and had been healed of his sickness about 10 years prior. So he went to this spot with nothing but an eagle feather and a sheet to cover up with, and 4 prayer smokes, corn husks with tobacco wrapped in them. And he smoked and he prayed, and he was there for a number of days. And he said on the night in question, he said that he could hear a rustling of leaves from over near Mount Scott. And when he looked up, he saw a flame that got bright and then it got dim. And then it got bright and it got dim. And as it got closer and closer to him, he could make out a human form. And he referred to this as the visitor that you see here in this painting. And he said, that visitor, he got right up in front of me. And he said, as it got closer and closer, I got more and more scared. Scared to the point where I couldn't speak, I couldn't move. Everything just completely stopped, came to a standstill. He said, but then when that visitor shot me with a fire, he said, my heart even stopped. But then he said, finally, the visitor spoke to me in my Comanche language. And he said to me, what are you doing here, son? And I told the visitor, I'm sick. And he said, there's nothing the matter with you. You're going to be all right. He said, but they sent me to take care of a man who's real bad off. And he started to take off, but then he turned around one last time. He said, and he looked at me and he said, son, he said, did you know that this whole world stops for just a very little while right before morning? And that's the time when things like me can enter into this world. Well, with that, the visitor took off to the direction of the west, sometimes called the direction of death. And Grandpa Chief was left in that spot. And hours later, when the sun was coming up, his son ran up to him and he said, Dad, he said, how did you make it through the night last night? It was so cold. And he said, well, where I was at, it was like springtime. And that's why if you look at the painting, you'll notice that where the figure is seated around there, there's frost a little ways away from him, because there was a hard frost on the ground everywhere except for where he had been. But the interesting part of the story is that his cancer was gone. And he never even bothered going back to the hospital after that. There was something in that encounter that healed him. Not only did it heal him, but it also, that power that went into him, he said, gave him the ability to heal others. Now, what I didn't mention was every time that visitor exhaled, that fire shot out of its mouth, and the visitor shot Grandpa Chief with the fire. And that's why he explained to me later that sickness is like a fire, and you have to fight fire with fire. And he eventually became what's known as a coal doctor, because he would build a fire when he had the patient with him, and he would take a red hot coal out of the fire and put it in his mouth in order to activate that power, so that then he could manipulate the flesh of the patient in order to make them well. Now, he didn't even know that he had that power at first, but he was walking along in this little town that he lived in, and there was an old Comanche medicine woman at the time who saw him, and she said, what happened to you? And he said, nothing. And she said, no, something's different about you. And he told her the story that I just told you. And you may not know it right now, but you're good for something. And sometime very soon, you're going to find out what that is. And all of a sudden, rumors started to go around of what he had been through, and patients who were sick began showing up at his home. And he had to kind of piece together how he was supposed to doctor them based on that experience and based on what he saw among the traditional healers back when he was a boy. Now, we don't know exactly how old he was because they didn't keep track of birth records at the time. But when he passed away, he was probably roughly 90 years old, which would have made him born in the late 1800s. So when he was thinking back to what he had seen as a boy, that was really that transitional period from their old ways to the reservation ways. So Grandpa Chief to me is an inspiration of a story of someone who is what I like to refer to as a wounded healer, somebody who was near death, and out of his healing, he became a healer and developed what could be referred to as a lifelong responsibility to take care of the needs of the people in his community. I mentioned before, it's all about story, and this is Grandpa Chief's granddaughter, so technically that would make her my sister through adoption. Her name was Juanita or Nita Patapony, and she was a very famous artist who passed away a little over a year ago. What you're looking at is one of her story hides. So the Comanches and the Kiowas and a number of other tribes, they kept track of the important stories of their people, the collective history of their people, on buffalo robes like the one that you see here. And this is a man who really had a profound impact on my life and taught me a lot about what it is, how it is that a person works with someone who's sick. This was my adopted uncle, Richie Tarza, known as Richard Tarza Sr., that you see here. And Uncle Richie was a medicine man and a man of tremendous faith. He believed in God, and he believed that his gift of healing came directly from God. The way that I got to know him was I used to take groups of people to live among the native people in Oklahoma, Montana, South Dakota, Wyoming, lots of different places on Turtle. And I had a group that was staying in teepees at a place called Fort Cobb Lake. And his brother was one of the rangers there who came to collect the fees. And when I explained to him why we were there, he said, "You should go see my father. He is like a tribal historian." So he told me where Richie lived. He didn't have a phone at the time. And he said, just go there and tell him I sent you. And I went one day when I had a group with me, about 20 people, and I didn't want to bring them in. So I just got out of the van, knocked on the door, and I told him who I was. And he said, "Oh, come on in." And he said, "I knew you were coming." And I said, "Oh, did you speak to your brother?" He said, "No, I haven't seen him in a while, but," he said, "I had a dream, and in my dream, God told me that someone would show up at my home and bring people with him from all over the world to hear these stories. And here you are." And he invited me in with the 20 some odd people that I had with me into his living room. And we began listening to the stories of his ancestors, the stories of his great-great-grandfather, Big Bo, who was a chief. He was a war chief, and later in his life, he was a medicine man or a healer as well. And we listened to these stories, and I brought people to his home for years and years. And one day while I was there, he said, "Lots of people have asked to write my stories and put them in a book, but I'd like you to be the one to do it, if you'd be willing to." And I took on that responsibility, and I began a process of writing something which is referred to as a collaborative ethnography. Now, often when anthropologists write about a subject, they'll spend time with their informants and take the information that they get and then change it, interpret it, describe it through their own lens. And I wanted this to be a collaborative ethnography, which is where the anthropologist is there simply to help, to provide a platform for the pure description from a native person's point of view. Unfortunately, the book wasn't ready until after Uncle Richie passed away, but he wanted this to be something to leave behind with his grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, and all of the generations to come. And it was an opportunity for me to really hear and shape some of those stories that would be preserved for a long time to come. When Uncle Richie died, it was really kind of devastating to me because I considered him a really important mentor in my life, someone that I turned to when I needed healing and when I needed to ask for advice. At his funeral, I met his aunt, who is the woman that you see here, Ella Faye Horse, who also took me into her branch of the family. She adopted me as a nephew also, and also gave me a Kiowa name in the process. And Ella Faye became an important storyteller for me. Often when I would go to her home, she would share some of the stories, some of the healing stories with me. And I'd love to share one of them with you. It's the story of St. Pete Tali. And I consider this to be truly a medicine story, one that you can hear and take in the medicine contained in the message of it. So the story goes like this. There was a long time ago, there was a boy named St. Pete Tali who was raised by his grandma at the edge of the Kiowa village. And they were at the edge because they were poor, and they were looked down upon by the people in their village. Anytime anybody offered something to them or made any kind of a compliment or said anything good about them, she always downplayed it, and she would say, oh no, we're too poor, we're too poor. And that's why they lived at the edge of the village. Well, she was the only one left to raise her grandson named St. Pete Tali, which literally means snot-nosed boy. And they say that things got really bad for the Kiowa people. They say that they were starving, and things got worse and worse and worse until they had no more food stored. And every day their hunters would go out looking for buffalo or any kind of game that they could kill. And every day they came down empty-handed. Finally, the chief said, I'd like any medicine people to come forward to see what they can do. And different medicine people would come forward and try their medicine, and nothing worked. Well, St. Pete Tali was old enough to go out on the hunts, and he went with the hunters and every day came back empty-handed. One day when he came back, his grandma asked him, do you have that deer horn spoon? Now, the reason she asked him to get the deer horn spoon is because the adults were so desperate to feed the children that they had taken to cutting up strips of rawhide and soaking them in water so that there was at least a broth with something that the children could have. And he needed his deer horn spoon in order to have the soup. So she asked him if he could bring his deer horn spoon with him. And he said no. He sheepishly said no. He said, I lost it on the hunt. And she got really angry with him. And she said, I told you not to bring that deer horn spoon with you. Now you've got no way to eat the soup. And she really, really kind of yelled at him until finally he went inside the teepee and cried himself to sleep with his head facing toward the opening at the bottom of the teepee. In the morning, he woke up and he announced to his grandmother, my medicine told me what to do. My medicine told me how we can get out of this problem. He went to the village and he went to the chief and announced to the chief, I have a way for us to feed the people. And all of the kids and all of the adults who had been so mean to him and his grandma in the past, they yelled out, oh, he doesn't have any medicine. He doesn't know anything. Don't pay any attention to him. And the chief said, well, everybody else has tried. Let's give this young man a try. So he announced to everybody, he said, we're going to build a fire here right in the middle of the village. And we're going to put a pot over it. And he said, get the women arranged over here, ready to form a circle around the cooking pot. So he set everything up, set it to boiling, had the women ready, and he looked into the pot and he could see the heads of deer floating in the water. And he announced to the people when they heard a rumbling sound, he said, all you women come forward and make an enclosure, a big enclosure around this by holding hands, but leave one end open. And he said, when the deer gallop in, he said, you men can each take one deer. The only thing that I ask is for the hearts, and I want you to pile up the hearts over here. So the deer all galloped into that enclosure, and the men, they killed the deer with their bows and arrows, and each one left a heart for St. Pete Tali and took the rest to go feed their families. And they say that that's why their people survived. It was because of the good work and the strong medicine of St. Pete Tali. And even today, when they sing the song, the Katas Story, the people still get a blessing. I think of this story as an important medicine story that has echoes of the story that I told you about my grandpa Chief, that somehow through our own suffering, when we're healed, it gives us the ability and the gift to be of a healing service to others. So that's one of many, many stories from LFA Horse, who was a dear treasure to the Kiowa people and passed on in the spirit world about 2 years ago. Later, I was adopted by an old man named Fred Parton, and I couldn't find a photo for him, but Fred introduced me to the peyote way of worship and of healing, known as the Native American Church. And it has the 4 pillars of love, faith, hope, and charity. And many of the healing practices of the Plains Indians were kind of rolled into this ceremony that uses peyote as a holy, sacred sacrament in these all-night healing ceremonies that take place inside of a teepee. After Fred passed away, another old man, Moses Starr, adopted me as a son and shared a lot with me about healing people in the community because he was given medicine, particularly for helping people who, families who had lost a family member recently. This is a photo taken with some other Cheyenne, very close friends of mine, Melissa and Wilbur and their son, Octonahy. Their son, incidentally, was murdered by police at the age of 18 years old. He had a mental disorder, and they called the police to ask them to come to help so that he wouldn't harm himself. And the last words that Wilbur said to the police as they broke into the house, while the rest of them were outside, were, "Don't kill my son." And unfortunately, they went in and killed him with 8 bullets, including 1 to the back of his head. And they live in a county called, ironically enough, Custer County. And the police were given medals of honor. There's a completely different story that they have about what happened than what the police say. And if you're interested in that story, that incidentally does have a spiritual resolution, I guess you could say, I encourage you to watch the documentary that I was a part of putting together that will air November 1st on PBS, and it's called Savage Land. And it's about that story and their own story of healing that they're going through right now. And this is my adopted sister through another family line. She's Cheyenne, Dr. Henrietta Mann. She was at one time one of the top professors, college professors in the United States. She was voted among the top 10 college professors by Rolling Stone magazine back some years ago. And this is at a conference that was put together to apologize by the Episcopal Church for their part in the Sand Creek Massacre in the 1860s, where the main person who led the massacre was a reverend, a minister from within the Episcopal Church. And after all this time, they apologized, in spite of the fact that he and his men carried with them the mutilated body parts of the people. They paraded them through the streets of Denver to celebrate what they had done to the Cheyenne people. And at this ceremony, Dr. Mann, my sister Henry, she was the representative of the Cheyenne people. And this is just a quick story about this particular ceremony. Is called the Sundance, that takes place once a year. I just came back from Oklahoma at the Sundance. You never take photos during the ceremony, but this is after the ceremony. I'm in front of the lodge, and it's a world renewal, because out of their sacrifice, they believe that the world is made new again. The dancers dance out in the hot, open sun with no food and no water from Friday until Sunday night. And out of that sacrifice, they believe that the people are healed and the world is made new again. And this is my sweat lodge, a ceremony of purification. After serving as a firekeeper and a helper for 20 some odd years, My adopted dad, Moses, he gave me the privilege of being able to run the sweat lodge, which is a healing ceremony, a rite of purification where hot stones are brought into that structure. It's covered up with blankets and tarps, and the heat is used, the steam, along with songs and prayers and stories of the people for their healing. Now, at the same time that I was involved in all of that I told you about Native North Americans, I also developed my initial interest in curanderismo, the traditional healing system from ancient Mesoamerica. And I had a professor who was teaching about ancient Mesoamerica, and he had done his field work in Oaxaca, Mexico, and that curanderismo is this traditional healing system that's practiced today. I became very interested in it and intended to do my field work partly in San Antonio, Texas, and then go and do a year residency living in an indigenous community in Oaxaca. But for a variety of reasons, I never ended up doing that. And my interest was just academic at first. But many, many years later, because of my involvement in the Native American Church, I joined a chapter of the Native American Church in Oklahoma, and I was told that I should attend the annual pilgrimage ceremony in Miranda City, Texas, and that's where this photo is taken, where this sacred medicine grows wild and where the people go to gather the medicine to bring it back for their ceremonies. And I flew into San Antonio, and while I was there, I realized that that was where I had originally planned on doing my field work. So I decided to try to find out if there was anybody practicing curanderismo. And I had found out that over the interim, in the years from the time that I was studying it up until then, it had mostly disappeared. But through a strange twist of fate, I met my first teacher in curanderismo, a woman who liked to be referred to as La Golondrina. And she's featured in a book by an anthropologist called Elizabeth de la Portilla. The book is called They All Want Magic. And I got to study under my dear friend, Doña Berta, for a number of years. She was my first teacher, but it's this teacher that I really want to talk about now. I entered an apprenticeship some years later with Elena Avila, who's the author of a book called Woman Who Glows in the Dark. And in my opinion, it's probably the best single book about the topic of curanderismo. And the reason that she had such a profound influence on me is that Elena was not only a curandera, but she also came from a Western scientific perspective. She was also a psychiatric nurse, and she brought to curanderismo a lot of what she had learned in her studies in Western medicine. And she came to use Platika, the heart-to-heart talk, in a way that kind of took it to a different level, I guess I would say. Mostly in Mexico, if you have a healing session with a curandero or a curandera, the Platika is relatively short. But for Elena, the Platika was the core of everything that we do. And to this day, I use the teachings that I learned from her in my one-on-one work. And Platika, I'll talk about it at the very end. Platika is the key to establishing a relationship and really evoking the story of the patient or the client, which is at the base of their healing process. Eventually, I went to the University of New Mexico summer conference on curanderismo that every year takes place for 2 weeks. This year it's a virtual program, but normally it's in person. And there I met a number of other people who were pivotal in my own personal learning. I went to my first Tamascal there. The Tamascal is the ancient Mesoamerican version of the sweat lodge that I showed you earlier. And it's a permanent structure where we go to sweat, where we go to tell our stories, where we go to be healed of our various ailments. I met Laurencio Lopez Nunez, who you see here, one of my most significant teachers, mentor, friend, brother, very, very close friend of mine who stays at my home here in New York. I go and stay at his home in Oaxaca, Mexico, and we bring people down to Mexico. He and I together co-lead programs there as well. Rita Navarrete Perez, she's the one who in many ways was responsible for me having my first Tamascal built. She asked me to go around and take all these different photos at different angles, which I didn't know why she wanted me to take all these photos. Then I got this idea. I thought, I wonder if I could have my own Tamascal. And when I asked her, she said, "You're ready right now as far as I'm concerned. You're already a warrior." And I guess I'm a little bit slow on the uptake because I didn't even realize that that's why she was having me take all those photos, because that was what she would be encouraging me to do. This is the finished product, Tamascal Atlachinoli, here at my home. And hundreds and hundreds of people have been through my Tamascal here on Long Island, where it is a community Tamascal. I maintain it for the healing needs of the people within the community. But it was actually Laurencio who taught me most of what I do in the ceremony. I went down to Oaxaca, Mexico, and spent a week with him to learn the very specific techniques in this Tamascal that you see here. He introduced me to a woman named Kata Gimenez, who is a curandera and a partera, or midwife, in her remote Mixe traditional community. They're an indigenous group that live in the very remote mountains of Oaxaca, Mexico, and live a lifestyle that is absolutely like living in the ancient world. Everything is grown on site. They cook with wood, they heat with the wood that you see here. And her story is actually one that is a classic story of healing. She was destined to be a healer. She had the marks on her that indicated that she was supposed to be a healer, but she turned her back on that responsibility and got sicker and sicker and sicker. Now, there's no car in this community. There's no use of cash. People do like a few things to get a few pesos here and there. Finally, her parents were able to scrape together enough pesos to get her to the nearest hospital, where the doctors were not able to find anything wrong with her, but yet she was near death. And it was her uncle who figured out what was wrong with her, that by turning her back on her responsibility as a healer, she had incurred this deathly illness. So he sent her off to this place, Simpaltepet, the most sacred mountaintop of the Mixe people, on a ceremony that would heal her and open her road as a healer. She not only told me the story, but she and her family invited me to come back to Oaxaca so that they could have that ceremony for me, so that I could make that sacrifice at the top of that mountain, which is another long story for another time. And the last person that I want to talk about in this is someone who I would come to years later than my other involvement with Native American, North American healers. But Luis Melmondon is, he is Cherokee and Lakota, but he's also an MD and a psychiatrist. And he kind of put together the teachings that he learned from his grandparents and what he saw in the native healing world with what he learned in Western conventional medicine. And he wrote a book on narrative medicine that I strongly recommend. The title of it is Narrative Medicine, and helped me to kind of rethink a lot of what I had learned about healing and how this weaving together of story is so important and critical to the healing process. I'll mention more about that in just a moment. And then finally, I wanted to mention the Dia de los Muertos celebration in Oaxaca, Mexico, is another great example of cultural healing, that within their culture, the sting of death is somehow less severe, lessened by these ceremonies that welcome in the spirits of their dead ancestors. And to our Western model of thinking, it may seem impossible, but in their belief system, there is a thin world that separates the world of the living from the world of the dead. And for 3 days, that world allows the dead to come back, to be with us, to celebrate with us, to eat with us, to drink with us. And somehow in that process, we are healed as well. So a couple of questions to close out our talk and make some, I hope, some important points. First is to ask this question: is conventional Western medicine objective? And that is what we are led to believe. We are led to believe that there are other healing systems around the planet that are primitive, that are less sophisticated, and that Western healing comes out of science that has an objective view of what is real and what is not real. Well, from the perspective of a philosophical movement called hermeneutics, that view is nonsense. Because in the hermeneutic circle, we say that every thinking is influenced by their history and their culture. And that goes for Western medicine as well. It is a story. It's a story that was built up based on our unique history and the way that our culture developed. But its story about what is real and what is not real, and what is healing and how it works, is not qualitatively different than any other system of healing on the planet. And that's why cultural anthropologists developed a branch of anthropology called medical anthropology that compares and contrasts methods of healing between our Western model and non-Western ways of healing. So I'm going to suggest that when we look at narrative medicine, how to take these ideas of healing and apply them within conventional modern medicine, we can look at 3 levels of story. There's the story that the patient has. And as I mentioned earlier, if a doctor typically has 10 minutes to spend with a patient, there's very little opportunity for story. But that story is critical to the patient's healing. There's also the professional's story, the doctor, the nurse, whoever the psychiatrist, the psychotherapist, whoever the Western professional is telling a story, an implicit story. And part of that story is convincing the patient that he or she can do what it takes to heal that person. And if any of you are healing professionals and you work with non-Western people, you may find that very often, once they're diagnosed, they don't follow through with treatment. And that's because the healing story that they have been told does not correspond to the one that they learned in their culture. That's why culture is critical in the work that healing professionals do with members of non-Western cultures. A psychotherapist by the name of Eduardo Duran, who is from a Pueblo community of Native Americans in New Mexico, has said that diagnosis is actually a naming ceremony from the perspective of his people, that once a diagnosis is made, that the patient becomes fixed with that becomes their identity. And that's why in their system of healing, they don't actually use a diagnosis. What he tells his patients is that they are being visited by a particular spirit. And that spirit may stay, it may leave, but that's what healing is. Healing is that opportunity for that spirit to take its leave. Again, It's a message very different than what we get from conventional medicine, but one that makes sense given their worldview. The third story is the healing story that builds confidence, what is referred to sometimes as the placebo effect. And sometimes I think of the placebo effect as being something that people in the Western conventional medicine, biomedicine model look down on it. They'll say, well, that's just the placebo effect. Well, in my opinion, the placebo effect is what it is to be a human being. Because from the perspective of indigenous healing, we say that all healing is self-healing. And what the professional does is to create the right circumstances for that healing to take place. So a healing story might be a story that you hear about someone else who's been through what you've been through and they survived. Unlike the story that we get of you have 6 to 12 months until you're going to die, for example. The healing story could be a story like the one that I told you that my aunt told about St. Pete, Tali. There are dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of healing stories that have their own medicine that actually help with the healing process. So to return to this theme of narrative medicine, how modern Western medicine can be informed by these indigenous ideas of medicine. What is it? Well, it's the soft side of medicine. Not necessarily the hard science, but the soft medicine of the heart. It honors the patient. It looks at the patient as being of equal status rather than relegated to the lower status of the professional. It embraces the history of that person and his or her people, their history, their background. It builds empathy so that by the mutual listening of the professional or the healer and the healee, it develops a relationship between the two of them that becomes a healing relationship. It allows the health professional to understand that patient's perspective and to get their suffering, to understand their suffering on the deepest level. And finally, it looks at the whole patient, their needs, their beliefs, their values. It also looks at them as a mind, a body, a spirit, and emotions, as Carline mentioned at the beginning, a truly holistic perspective. And a couple of the ideas and tools that I believe are most significant from curanderismo. The first is a concept known as susto. And susto is somewhat analogous to trauma, although it's not identical with trauma. But the idea of susto is that when we experience something that shocks the system, and by the way, that includes a medical diagnosis. A medical diagnosis is a susto. What it does is it sets up a shock in the system of that person. And a part of them leaves in order to be protected. We would refer to this as dissociation within the Western model and understanding. In that dissociation, there is the attempt to protect the self, but there's a part that becomes missing, and a part of the vitality and life force of that person is lost until it's brought back through the various techniques that we utilize in curanderismo and in certain techniques of therapy and other ways of dealing with susto. And I want to just mention quickly a couple of things about the Platika that Carline mentioned. She described it through the verb in Spanish desahogar, which means to undrown, when the patient undrowns him or herself. And what are some of the building blocks of Platika? One is active listening. And the reason that it's active listening is we normally think of the process of listening as being something passive, when the person speaking is active and the person listening is passive. But in this form of listening, it's extremely active. And it's active in paying attention and aligning with the words, the thoughts, the intentions, and the emotions of the person, the client or the patient. It's sacred listening because within this perspective, we bring in the aspect of the divine. Whatever it is that that patient believes is divine, their spiritual and religious understanding of him or herself and how they fit into the wider universe is a part of our healing practice. Third is holding space. The ability of the practitioner to be with uncomfortable emotions, to be there with someone who is crying and weeping, to give them a chance for their emotions to be expressed in order to transform them. And finally, encouraging heart-based speech, the ability to communicate through the heart space. And this is a type of communication that many of us in our world are not familiar with, but it's getting in touch with emotions and expressing them in order to be able to shift them. So we say that we communicate from our heart. We use the words from our mind to communicate them to the other person. And that's just a kind of a very, very brief introduction to what the Platika is. So I want to close with this really, I believe, a beautiful quote from Rita Sharon. Narrative medicine is a commitment to understanding patients' lives, caring for the caregivers, and giving voice to the suffering. So it's an understanding that is based on this mutuality, this deep relationship between the healer or the medical professional and the patient. And with that, I will turn it over to Carline. Let me stop sharing. Turn it over to Carline for some thoughts and questions. And I forgot to get to the last one, but you can reach me at bobvetter.com with any questions that we don't get to tonight. Okay, Carline, take it away.
Thank you so much, Bob, for all the sharing of your stories and the many stories of all of those who you included this evening. We do have a couple of questions that I'll share with you. When you talk about wounded healers, do you think it's necessary to have been badly wounded to be a successful healer? Or I guess more broadly, how does that inform or guide one's own exploration?
I think that you could easily answer yes and no to that question. And as we sometimes say, isn't it great that both of them can be true at the same time? So the answer is no, you don't have to be badly wounded to be a healer. I'm not sure I've met anybody who hasn't been badly wounded. And what I mean by that is that we can hardly live our life without experiencing suffering at some time in our lives. And part of developing the compassion that is needed to work with another person is to get in touch with your own suffering. So the answer is no on one level, and the answer is yes on another level, that it is necessary to have been wounded or to be in touch with one's own wounds and the wounds of the people who are around you that you see suffering in order to develop that kind of relationship with the patient.
Thank you. And our time is running short, but I do want to pose this idea of the evolution of someone's story. You know, we come to share our story with a friend or with a clinician, a therapist, but the idea that those stories also change and evolve and don't necessarily remain static. Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic flow of stories as part of healing?
Yeah, I've heard people say that this work is analogous to peeling back layers of an onion. And that the more you peel back one layer, the more you go to something else. And in this evolving story, we establish more and more connections between the events in our lives, the fluctuations in emotion, and how it is reflected in our physiology and somatically manifested as disease. And in curanderismo, that's extremely important. So our stories do evolve. Somebody recently told me that we can look at this rather than as an onion, we're peeling back garlic. And that's really more my experience, that it's more like garlic, because sometimes you have one clove that you peel back and you don't even know that the clove right next to it is about to need your attention as well. So stories do evolve, and a lot of it is our connection with the emotions of the story. And of course, we know that emotions are connected to our stress response. We know that emotions are connected to our immune system. And, there's a whole subdiscipline called psychoneuroimmunology that looks at the relationship between emotions and disease. So yeah, stories evolve, stories change, stories get deeper, they deepen as we start to look at them.
And that's part of that whole discovery and uncovering of both ourselves and our stories.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much, Bob, for sharing what you've done, and thank you all so much for joining us this evening.
Yes, thank you, Carline. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Friends and Relations on YouTube. This webinar will remain on YouTube if you'd like to recommend it to others. We hope you'll check out some of our other offerings on the Pacific College YouTube channel as well. I'm sorry, Bob, I interrupted you. If you want to have a last word before we say goodbye.
The last word is, I'm looking at these questions and I would love to answer them. Get to me on my email, bobv1111@aol.com, or go to my website, bobvetter.com. I would love to answer these. These are great questions.
Great. Well, we look forward to all seeing you next time.
Thank you so much.